Podcasts on UNCTV.org are made possible through the financial contributions of viewers like you, who invite you to join them in supporting UNC-TV.
An elementary school teacher who grew up in eastern North Carolina listening to and reading trickster and mystery stories writes some stories inspired by the legend of John Henry. And suddenly a major publisher signs him to a 3-book contract. Wow, how did it happen? Well, we'll ask John Claude Bemis, the author of The 9-Pound Hammer, next on North Carolina Bookwatch.
Funding for North Carolina Bookwatch is made possible through the financial contributions of viewers like you, who invite you to join them in supporting UNC-TV, and by the Mary Duke Biddle Foundation, Quail Ridge Books and Music, and the North Carolina Humanities Council.
Welcome to North Carolina Bookwatch. I'm D.G. Martin, and my guest is John Claude Bemis, who's the author of The 9-Pound Hammer. John Claude Bemis, welcome.
Thank you.
Well, we're glad to have you here. As I mentioned earlier, you grew up in eastern North Carolina and then spent a time teaching elementary school up in Hillsborough. All the while, you've got a second interest in music,
right.
And the music seems to inform your writing, as does your experience teaching children.
Right.
But how in the world did all of this come together for a 3-book contract?
Well, it's been an interesting and unexpected journey, certainly. So, but I'm a UNC graduate and was living in this area up in Orange County and teaching elementary school. And like you said, playing music. I've always just loved music and folk music in particular. But it was teaching elementary school students when I kind of rediscovered those books that I loved from my childhood and began to see that experience that young people have when they read a book, that particular excitement and
like what were your favorites that you read today?
Well, growing up, I loved books like My Side of the Mountain by Gene Craighead George, about the boy who runs away and lives in the woods, or The Incredible Journey about the animals, and books, fantasy books like The Hobbit. I was a big fan of fantasy and science fiction. But I loved also reading folklore and mythology, world mythologies. But I really loved that folklore that comes out of the South. The Jack Tales that Richard Chase collected up in the mountains of North Carolina, those Brer Rabbit, those kind of trickster stories that come out of the South, those African American stories that originate in Africa with other characters and have become very American here. I love those.
I mean, it's not politically correct to talk about Uncle Remus, but like the Uncle Remus stories.
Yes, absolutely. And those stories, while some of the presentations on those have obviously been controversial, the stories themselves have a rich part.
They're really good.
Yeah, they're just wonderful. They're wonderful.
Well, you grew up from a different generation from those kids that you were teaching, and
right.
My golly, I grew up several generations before that. What did you learn from teaching kids that helped you write for them?
That's an interesting question, and I think that one of the things I began to really notice was part of the experience that kids have with books. Not only is it that they are entertained by them, but that they provide a certain model for kids. Think of the fairy tales. You think of a Little Red Riding Hood, and those fairy tales in a way are the original children's books, children's stories, and they can be a cautionary tale in a way that kids hearing those stories are warned. Right? Yeah, the predators in the world, and in a way, children's books today still somewhat operate not in a way that's meant to be preachy, but in a way that when kids identify with the characters in the book, what they're seeing is a kid who is confronting difficulties, the worst possible fears, maybe being orphaned, or it could just be bullies at school. But they're seeing someone else who's going through those struggles and is tackling it with cleverness and courage and keeping their moral center through it all, and not only surviving potentially the worst, the big bad wolves of the world, but coming out the better for it. And so I think in a way that is a little bit of the psychological component that's there for kids and why they enjoy it. So
I do want to talk about your book or your books, but I'm also enchanted with the experience of your teaching kids and then writing for them. And so I wondered, did you experiment with your kids a little bit with your own stories in addition to those that are part of the standard accepted curriculum?
I didn't actually. I think I was a little shy about it, and at the time I was really just writing almost in secret. I would teach during the day, and I would come home in the afternoons, and elementary schools often end a little bit earlier than other schools and normal jobs, and I had some time in the afternoon, and it began as a hobby, something to that I enjoyed doing, but it wasn't something that I shared with my kids at school. But I was at the same time watching what they enjoyed in the books that they were reading at school, and reading those books because I honestly enjoy reading this literature that's written for young people. And so just the opportunity of being an elementary school teacher and being able to have these conversations with young people about what they enjoyed.
So for part of the day, I mean, you're the leader of the class, but for part of the day, you are in part one of them.
Oh, yes.
And you have your conversations, the way you think about things, you become a a child
right.
for a time.
Well, I think that's important for an elementary school teacher to be to get down there with the kids and participate with them and not just lecture up there.
All right, so you go home. Now I want you, we brought you here because you've got this important new book and a series of books, starting on you call it the Clockwork.
The Clockwork Dark is the series title. So, yes.
The first book, which we're talking about and celebrating, is The 9-Pound Hammer. Right. And tell us how all this experience came together, and when you went home to write after teaching school, what kind of tale did you come up with?
Well, I experimented with some different types of stories, and a lot of them were no good. I would never want anyone to read now. But it was a learning experience for me, and it was something that I was just enjoying the process, enjoying learning how to write, because I don't have, I didn't get a degree in creative writing. So I'm coming about this just from being
from a storyteller.
Reading, and being a storyteller. But one thing I began to notice in the classroom, as not only for what kids were picking out to read, but also from my own enjoyment, was young people love magic. They love books with a lot of fantasy in it. From the fairy tales to Harry Potter, and I love those kind of stories too. And I began to notice how many of them tend to focus on very European. You have the wizard, the dragon, the knight, the castle, all this kind of stories that pull from images and settings that are either from British legend, European mythology, making to wonder, where are our good American kind of fantasy stories, something that pulls on our folklore, because I'm a particular lover of Southern folklore and American legends, and I wanted to merge those interests into a story. So that's what I began to explore. Was
tell us
how can we take this,
now. I want to know. So tell us a little bit. You don't have to give away the whole story. There's just too much in it to give away very much. But introduce us to the 9-Pound Hammer and the story. In fact, take us. Well, you have some great train rides.
Yes,
take us on the first train ride that is the beginning of your book.
Right. The story opens on a train coming out of New York into the South.
And what kind of time period roughly?
This is the 1890s.
Okay.
So this is the late 19th century.
So we're on a train.
We're on a train, and our young protagonist, 12-year-old Ray, he and his sister this is an orphan train that's taking a group of orphans, hopefully to find new homes. And young Ray, he's
out of the big cities of the Northeast,
that's
somewhere
right.
where they can be happy.
That's right, with the hope. And young Ray, he lost his mother to scarlet fever years ago, and his father has disappeared 8 years earlier. And this is a man, his father is someone that he remembers as being bigger than life, a man who spoke with animals, who owned this lodestone, this particularly unusual stone that he gave to Ray years ago when
lodestone is a magic stone.
A lodestone, a lodestone technically is just a naturally magnetized rock. It's what compasses are made out of. but they've always held a place of mystery for people just because of that unusual component that it is magnetic. And so it's...
So you got Ray and his sister on the orphan train. Right. He's got his lodestone, and what are you going to do with this?
Well, it seems to be pulling him somewhere, and he decides to set off to find out not only where this lodestone is drawing him, but he's hoping that it'll lead to some answers about what happened to his father, who disappeared years ago.
Now, I don't want to anticipate too much of your story, but you say this whole series and this book is inspired by and related to the John Henry legend.
Right.
Can you tell us how this is going to work out?
Well, when I was initially dreaming up this idea for this story, I began looking at a lot of Southern folklore, a lot of legends to pull into it. And as a musician, I've been fascinated by this story of John Henry. Right? He's this figure from Tall Tale, this American folk figure who's this African-American steel driver who works on the railroad. And one day a steam drill is brought in that's supposed to replace the workers. And so John Henry and the other workers, they're worried that they're going to lose their job. So they decide to have a competition. See who can really do a better job. Is it going to be John Henry, or is it going to be this steam drill? It's a man versus machine sort of thing. And so they set up the steam drill on one side of the tunnel, John Henry on the other, so you can dig out the most. And at the end of the competition, John Henry digs out more. He emerges the winner. But to me, this was always the fascinating part about the story. Is when he comes out, he falls down dead.
So he wins, but he dies.
Exactly. So it's a tragic. Did he win or didn't he? Did he? Is he a hero, or is this something heroic, or is this tragic? And this always kind of fascinated me about that John Henry story. And I think it tells us so much about the anxieties of that late 19th century, about technology, all these new machines. What are they going to mean, for our humanity? Well, and in a way, this is the world that we live in today, right?
Well, one of the, great interesting things about your book is that you create a sort of a machine-like villain,
right,
who's evil,
right.
Well, and so this comes out of that story, sort of.
Well, what happened was thinking of that original John Henry story. I had that what if moment that I think a lot of authors have this what if that kind of guides their story sometimes. And for me, it was thinking about that John Henry story, and what if that was not the story that we've always heard about John Henry wasn't true? What if it wasn't that he died in a competition against a steam drill, but what if he was trying to destroy something that was that was evil, like you said, something very sinister, this machine. In the book, the Clockwork Dark, where it's what the series takes its title from, this clockwork as a kind of old-fashioned word for machinery. And so in the 9-Pound Hammer, John Henry is dead, and the young heroes are discovering what really happened to him, and that they are taking up his fight against this villain and his machine, which quite literally is meant to rob us of our humanity, to steal people's souls.
So in the back, now your book has lots of other stories, but the shadow over it all is this conflict.
Yes.
That's happening.
And this will carry us through all three of the books.
All three of the series. Well, I have to tell you that I enjoyed some of the side stories.
Thank you.
And we talked about the orphan train, and there's a whole story about that. There's another train. And when you tell us about the other train and how it fits into the story.
Well, Ray, following this lodestone and seeing where
this is the little, is he 12? How old
he's
is
12 years old. That's right, yes. And so he's set off on his own for the first time, and he winds up in the American South, and the lodestone leads him to one of these old-time medicine shows, traveling in a rickety old train through the South to perform and sell their tonics. But he quickly discovers that this medicine show is not like a normal medicine show. So,
in what respect is it not?
In that, the typical...
I mean, there would not be any typical medicine show.
I guess that's true, yes. But historically, a medicine show would have been some performers, comedians, some sideshow sort of people, and the medicines, the snake oil, the idea that there's no medicinal value to these medicines, right? They're just conning people into buying.
Now, don't tell me that. I'm just I'm relying on too many of them.
But the medicine show that he winds up with, Ray watches this first performance and sees that these children and some adults that are in there, they have particularly unusual power. They have a sword swallower, they have a snake charmer, relatively typical. But then as he starts to watch the other ones, there's this strong man, this giant kid, Conquer, who, how could someone get that big? You know, how could someone get that strong? And the escape artist, this young girl who has a tattoo on her hand that glows and can get her out of any lock and chain. So he discovers these other performers have magical powers, you know, so that they're
And where does that lead us? What does that do to the story?
Well, what this does is it kind of brings together a team of heroes who are going to take up John Henry's fight. And I think that young readers and, you know, the kind of stories that I enjoy these people who discover that they have these talents that they can use for good, or it can sometimes lead them astray, as is the case with some of the characters in the book, but that they are discovering what their talents are and what they can do with them. And Ray, this boy, our hero who we're really following, here he is amongst all these other people, and he doesn't seem to have talents of his own, but he just hasn't discovered them yet. And that's what part of the story is Ray discovering his own powers. So.
Well, I love the medicine show. I just really identified with it. I wanted to be in this medicine show, like as Ray did as well. Now, another unlikely scene comes because you figured out a way to bring pirates into the story.
Right.
And why do you need? First of all, we're in the South somewhere in the 1890s, and
right.
Pirates may be an unlikely kind of thing,
right.
but you make it work. And why did you need pirates, and then what were the challenges? Then how did you meet the challenge of making it work in the story?
Well, I grew up in eastern North Carolina. When you grow up in eastern North Carolina, you love pirates. You can't help it. There's so many pirate stories. And this world that I imagined that this book is taking place in a way, is not our world. That there are things that are happening in here that make it it's a magical America of the 1890s. And so the idea of being able to introduce these pirates, but not as Blackbeard-style pirates. These are 19th century riverboat pirates traveling on a paddle wheel steamer and robbing little towns through the South. And so I had this idea for the character kind of cast among the pirates, and I like the idea that at first they might seem to be adversaries to the heroes, that Ray and some of the other children wind up getting captured by this pirate queen, this rowdy woman with all, you know, this red hair who rides on an alligator and so forth, that at first she captures them, and then the children, through their cleverness in a way, are able to befriend her or to win her over to their side ultimately. And that was part of what fascinated me was just how to work the dynamics with those.
Well,
those
it fascinates me as well. And you know, you talk about Eastern North Carolina, and you and your colleagues down in Eastern North Carolina make us forget that the pirates were really evil. You know, they were bad guys, and we think of them as having good qualities, and maybe they did have. As a lot of bad people do have some good qualities. Are your pirates good guys or bad guys?
They are not necessarily. They are good at heart. Their actions aren't always good. I mean, they are robbing and pillaging and so forth. But isn't that's one of the things that I wanted to explore with the book was, as I said earlier, you know, not going to these very European archetypes of the knight, the dragon, the wizard, that kind of thing, and exploring what would be American archetypes for characters. And one that I think we really like as a country is the idea of the outlaw. You know, the Jesse James, the Blackbeard, who, in a way, yes, if we had to be there at the time that they were doing their things, we would probably take these people for being, you know, wicked, you know. But we like to romanticize those people who are the outlaws, the people who, you know, the individualists in a way. And in other words, it's kind of, I think, a particularly American approach to these type of characters.
Do you imagine that these books are read by your target audience? These are fourth and fifth graders. Do they these are a book that they would take to bed, or would it be something that parents would read to the children?
I've heard from both. From one of the really wonderful things is hearing from parents and hearing from kids. You know, get email now and from physical letters, and I've heard from some families who the parents are reading it to the kids and just enjoying it together, to hear it read aloud, because I put a lot of work into, as a singer, I think often about how things sound, and I wanted this to be a book that sounded great read aloud. But I hear also from kids who got the book and cracked it open and within a day had finished it, and which is exciting for me because those books that I loved in my childhood were those ones that I read in a day, and then the next week I was ready to start it over again. So.
Well, it's interesting. You mentioned the musical background, and music rings through your stories. You've talked about the John Henry legend. You brought your guitar.
I did. Right.
And would you share with us just a little bit of your excitement of the music, and then tell us how it related to your story?
Okay, sounds good. We'll do the John Henry, a little version I have of the John Henry songs. John Henry, he's a legendary character. But this is really something that's been passed down through song rather than something that has been written down. So I'm going to do my version of the John Henry song. John Henry was way up on the mountain, and the mountain it reached so high. The ramblers called out to John Henry, said, "You can almost touch the sky." Said, "You can almost touch the sky." Look away over yonder, all you ramblers. You can't see like me. And he hollered out in a high lonesome cry, "This hammer will be the death of me. This hammer will be the death of me." Well, the mister, he brought out a steam drill and took it to the end of the track. He said, "Bring out your best, we're gonna have a test. If my machine wins, the rest of you can pack. My machine wins, the rest of you can pack." John Henry called out to his captain, "Oh, Captain, you go into town and bring me back my 9-pound hammer. I'll beat that old steam drill down. Yes, I'll beat that old steam drill down." Well, the mister that invented the steam drill thought his machine was mighty fine. But John Henry laid out 12 feet of track. The steam drill only laid out 9. The steam drill only laid out 9. So John Henry rose up from the mountain, just bigger than anything you've ever seen. And the ramblers hollered out in a cry, "John Henry, he's beat that machine. Yes, John Henry, he's beat that machine." But John Henry fell down to his knees, just dying with that hammer in his hand. And the very last words John Henry said, "A man ain't nothing but a man. A man ain't nothing but a man. A man ain't nothing but a man, Lord, Lord. A man ain't nothing but a man."
Wow. Oh, man, well, that's great. And I see, I can feel the music just coming in magically into the book. And I wish we had time for more songs.
Oh.
But I've got a couple of questions, and we're almost out of time, but I got a couple of questions I got to ask you. I've got a lot of friends who think they can write for children. They're my age, they haven't talked to children, they just think they can write a simple story. Well, most of them can't, but maybe some of them can. Right. And if you were talking to somebody my age who wants to write for his children or grandchildren or great-grandchildren, right, or for others, what have you learned that might be helpful?
Well, I think it's important to read these type of stories and to read them a wide variety, ones that are classics, but also the contemporary stories, because sometimes as adults we tend to think of what children read as the books we read when we were young, and books have changed so much, and now that there's, they are, it's a different audience, in other words.
But I don't have to go and teach elementary school.
No, it's not necessary. And I think a lot of people are drawn to it because they have a grandchild, they have children, or they know young people, and they have those kids in mind as an audience. So.
You mentioned earlier when we first got started that there is that there's a moral value or a moral piece of these stories in terms of cautionary or also learning lessons.
Right.
How much moral teaching can you put into a book and not destroy the story part of it?
And you certainly can. And I think that is a mistake that a lot of people make, is the idea that they want the story to teach kids something necessarily. And that seems to often backfire. That in the end, it has to be an entertaining story. It has to be something that young people are just going to get absorbed with the characters and where the story's going. But at the same time, often these characters are learning lessons that are going to be natural to the story process. And that's the value I think that kids come out of it, is when they connect, they identify with those young people.
In a word, is there a lesson that you'd like children and parents to walk away from your book with?
Well, it's just that part of growing up is discovering your own talents, and that's what Ray is doing in here, is discovering who he is, and that's what we're all trying to do, aren't we?
Well, John Claude Bemis, thank you for sharing your book and your music and your thoughts about writing for children.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks to all you all for listening. Our guest has been John Claude Bemis, who's the author of 9-Pound Hammer and 2 more books in the series. Thanks to all of you for listening. We'll be back here same time next week to introduce you to another great North Carolina author.
Funding for North Carolina Bookwatch is made possible through the financial contributions of viewers like you, who invite you to join them in supporting UNC-TV, and by the Mary Duke BIDDLE Foundation, Quail Ridge Books and Music, and the North Carolina Humanities Council.
Podcasts on UNCTV.org are made possible through the financial contributions of viewers like you, who invite you to join them in supporting UNC-TV.